Hello, and welcome to episode 95 of PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in recently rainy Napa Valley.
Oh, good for you. You guys probably could use the wash. How you doing up there?
I'm doing well, and in fact, the rain was quite welcome because this should signal the end of fire season up here, which is always a happy day.
It's a dry place most of the time, so good for you getting wet.
Indeed. So,
speaking of wet
in Los Angeles,
things are fine here. I was going to go right to drinks. It's been that kind of weekend. I'm thirsty, Dave.
It's been quite a week. Later on this week, we'll have some big news for everybody, but right now, let's talk about the alcohol. What are you drinking today?
There you go. Well, this will tie into the song, really the group that we've chosen for the song today. I was telling you earlier, actually over the weekend, as we saw one reading comp passage topic come up with Outkast, the rap group, that I used to be in a bowling league in Atlanta with Big Boi, one half of the dynamic duo of Outkast. I don't know him or anything, but we used to socialize every couple of weeks when he would come and bowl, and he would always win because he was very good. But we would drink White Russians till we couldn't see the pins. So in honor of Big Boi, in honor of Outkast, I'm having a White Russian.
Well, I don't have a cool story like that, so I'm just having a Moscow Mule because it's kind of a cold drink. It's got a little bit of a bite, a little spicy gingerness to it, and vodka, of course, so keeping it straight up today with the drinking.
There you go. Yeah, we're both on the vodka train today. Go us.
Yeah, normally I'm the White Russian guy, so it's astonishing to see you drinking one.
Flip the script, man. Well, again, pour one out for Big Boi.
Wait, something happened to him?
No. Well, he doesn't get to bowl with me, so I'm sure he's heartbroken.
No, okay, good.
I
got confused there about the pour one out for him. I was like, wait,
no.
Is this breaking news that I'm just discovering?
No, we've had enough of those already this year. No more.
We have. And by the way, the song by Outkast is their super mega hit, Hey Ya, which is a great song. I really like Outkast, and very multi-talented, so very cool choice. And to see it on the LSAT, as we'll come up a little bit later, is always astonishing.
Yeah, people don't know what in the world we're talking about. It'll make sense soon enough, I think.
Yeah, let's get right into the LSAT world then, Jon. What's going on this week?
Well, the biggest thing going on that I want to promote is we've got a couple of huge webinars coming up. Huge in terms of, obviously, what we feel is important, but also huge, I think, in terms of the impact they can have on people. The first one, most immediately, is you and I are doing a webinar Wednesday night, our classic crystal ball. This one will focus on the November test coming up.
Yeah, and that's kind of a cool webinar because there have been multiple LSATs released since the last crystal ball. And so one of the things we're planning on doing is showing the predictions that we've made in the past and comparing them to how these tests recently have looked, which I think will be illuminating.
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, we have 9 new LSAT sections that you and I have both combed through. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. So that's what the focus of this next discussion will be. We also have a webinar on Thursday night on circular games, that old outlier type that terrifies people. So that'll be a fun discussion too.
Yeah, and that's a cool webinar as well. If you're not familiar with circular games, definitely something to check out. And we look at a couple different types in there. And so that will certainly make you feel better prior to the next LSAT that's coming up.
Yeah.
Other than that,
I do want to reassure people that's not meant to be ominous like we expect a circular game necessarily. This is more insurance than prediction.
Cue the Jaws theme music. Here it comes. That's not what we're saying.
No.
We're not making that particular prediction, and those two things are not connected. The Circular Games webinar, I think, was on the schedule long before we put this crystal ball in. So that is not a designed pairing that we are trying to signal people
with. Yeah. And those are free. They're open to the public. We'll send a link or put a link in these notes so you can just go sign right up. We encourage you, obviously, to attend live because then you can ask questions and engage.
Yeah, and as we saw in the personal statement webinar that we did last week, people have a lot of questions about these things, and we try to really knock out tons of them. And remember, with these crystal ball webinars, it is free to the public for the very first and only night that we offer these. Thereafter, the recording is only available to PowerScore students through one of our online student centers. So keep that in mind as well. The other thing that happened, obviously, and we were just talking about it a moment ago, was the fact that the October 2021 LSAT has now almost been completed. In fact, we pushed this podcast back several days to account for the fact that there were testers all the way through yesterday.
Yeah.
There is still one more testing day. That is this upcoming Thursday. But let's talk about the October LSAT and all that it encompassed and what it was.
All right, let's start with some happy notes on the October test, which are some of the stats that we know about. The first being score release. The score release is still, I mean still in the sense of we're going to talk about some things that could have affected it, but happily didn't, still set for the morning of October 27th. So was that next Wednesday?
Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 a.m. Pacific, which is terrible for me.
It's terrible for me too, because that's the day after my birthday. So
Yeah,
I will not be up at
asleep.
6 a.m. unless I'm still up at 6 a.m.
I'll be working. That's the difference about 9 a.m. or 6 a.m. Pacific time is I'm off and awake. You are.
I'm occasionally awake.
Yes, but not for the same reason. I just got up. You haven't gone to bed.
So yeah, that's the score release, and that'll even be, that date will hold true for people testing even this coming Thursday on the 21st. So a quick turnaround there, but again, that's good news. You, I think, have some stats on the attendance numbers for this test, don't you?
Yeah, these aren't the final numbers. I haven't received those yet. Usually I have them by now, but this was a very unusual administration, as we will talk about. So that test started over a week ago on a Saturday, and there were originally around 7,000 people slated to test on Saturday, and I think it ended up being a bit over 5,000, which we'll talk about momentarily. Mm-hmm. Sunday was another 7,000. Tuesday, I think, was around 8,500, and then they lost some, so that ended up in the 8,000 range, though. And then on Thursday, they had two different forms of the test going on. They had the paper and pencil test takers under accommodations. There's usually about 250 of them. They had international test takers as well, about 1,250 of them. And then we know there were a few retakers thrown in there as well from the incident that occurred on the very first day of the test. And then finally, yesterday on Sunday, we had a surprise pop-up LSAT that came out of nowhere. That was another 500 people or so that were individuals making up the test. And so you had around 22,000 individuals who ultimately were able to get through the exam and will ultimately post results on this. So that's substantial. It's not a small test.
No, that's a pretty good size one. Which is why it was all the more distressing to start Saturday the way we did. If it had only been a couple hundred people that day instead of the original 7,000, I don't think we would have felt the impact quite so heavily.
No, and so let's just jump right into what happened, because last Saturday is often a day where, things start slowly for us, and then information begins trickling in. We see various things online. But very quickly, it was apparent that there was some type of issue occurring. And no one was really sure. I kind of understand exactly what happened now. I can't really share all the details of it. But ultimately, the system went down. And I think you can, typically expect that when a website goes down, servers are involved somewhere. But LawHub, which ultimately controls all these tests, went offline. And it affected everybody. It affected not just test takers who were in on the LSAT. It affected people who were trying to use LawHub to take practice tests. It affected our students because our system is tied to LawHub and it went down. It affected every LSAC company because all their systems went down as well. But the most important ones out of that group were the people taking the test. Losing a practice test sucks, in my opinion. But if you're in the middle of an LSAT and you've gotten, say, 3/4 of the way through, and then the test falls apart on you and you just get kicked out, that's devastating.
Yeah.
It's scarring psychologically. And we saw that happen to really a huge number of people. And the issue had really two components to it. First off, people who were taking the test, that was it. They just went offline. Yeah. All of a sudden, it was like, you're kicked out. So that's horrible because then you're trying to get back in and you're panicking and you're like, will I be able to restart? Am I losing time? And then once the outage began, if you had a testing time within that window of the outage, you couldn't start. So you're sitting there like, what's going on? And then you started to see the panicked messages online, quite rightly, describing the problem. And then people who were taking it 3-4 hours later were like, am I screwed? It was terrible. It was a massive disaster. And having spoken to the people at LSAC, they were well aware of the impact this was happening, and they were struggling at first to simply identify what had caused the issue. and then later on to figure out how to deal with it, which
Yeah.
is not nearly as easy as you would think.
Yeah, I talked to so many people. I talked to one guy who was 2 questions from the end of his test, section 4, like question 23, and it booted him and he never got back in. And he was forced to start over later in the week. And you know what? He was an incredibly good sport about the whole thing. I'm not sure what I would have broken, but I'd have trashed this place like a Motley Crue hotel room or something. It would have been a scene. He was chill about it, which is, I mean, it's what he should do. It's all you can do.
I don't have that personality.
I wish frankly, I wasn't jealous of what he went through, but I was jealous of how he handled it because it was remarkably amicable.
So, some people have that, you know. If I lose or something bad happens, I get mad for a few minutes. I'm like irritated. Sometimes I see these people on reality TV and they get like booted out with a blind side or something, and they're like so good natured. I'm like, not me. I'd be cursing.
Burn the house down.
I'd be very angry about it. This would have caused me some anger. Let's put it that way.
To try to quantify this to some degree, and I don't have the numbers, and you can talk me down if I'm wrong. Right? It felt like the system was down for several hours, maybe 3 or 4 at least.
I don't know if it was that long.
It felt like that.
Yeah, well, I think every minute feels like an eternity when that's going on. I'm not sure it was more than 2.5 hours. I don't know for sure, unfortunately, but I think it affected probably upwards of 2,000 people.
Yeah, the
is a
numbers certainly
lot.
suggest that. That's a huge number of people. That's about 10% of all the people who ended up taking the thing.
Yeah, and let's talk about that scenario that you just talked about, because this was something that you and I jumped into action on Saturday, and I really felt like we had no choice. And also, perhaps we were the only people who were around who could kind of like give answers. And a lot of times I would hedge and say, I think this is what's going to happen, or I think this is what they'll do. And it's really kind of like best estimate. It's also built on what we've seen in the past. For example, I knew that as students were getting kicked out of the test, that we were going to have a major problem. And a lot of people were like, well, I'll just restart. And I had to tell a number of people that's not how it works. Unfortunately, it's a security issue. If you have seen test content and then you are kicked out at some point, they do not want to allow you back into the test. Typically, if you can get back in quickly, they will allow you to continue. But if you're out of there for 30, 45 minutes, an hour or 2 hours, now they're concerned about the security aspect of it. And so they make sure that you have a new test entirely when you retake it, which is, it sucks because it's not your fault that this happened. And that's the worst thing is that I'm so sympathetic towards the individuals who had this occur, because it's like, well, that wasn't your fault.
Yeah, these people didn't do anything wrong. In fact, they did everything right. They were taking the test as planned. Mm-hmm. And through no fault of their own, not only could they not finish, but they were forced to start from question 1, start over entirely.
Yeah, and typically on another day.
On a different day with a different test. So if things were going your way, I mean, this was just the ultimate gut punch. I'm sure some people it felt like a bit of a lifeline. Boy, I'm getting crushed here. I get a restart? All right.
Yeah, that's the problem too, is like the casino effect is really strong there. Somebody who's doing great and is loving it and is just building confidence, when that happens, it's a devastator. If you're struggling and you're thinking, look, this isn't my day, I may cancel this thing, then that happens, you're like, maybe the gods have smiled on me. So, but that security issue is a real big thing, and this has been consistent for a long time with this form of the test. So when people started saying what had happened, I was like, they're going to restart your test with a whole new exam. And I felt bad delivering that news, but I also knew that almost assuredly it was right. And of course, it turned out to be the case. Those people who didn't get into the test and hadn't seen anything, they didn't have that issue. They still had whatever test that they needed to take queued up for them eventually. But when you see a test and you're in the midst of it, and then you get kicked out, if you don't get back in quickly, you are looking at having to redo the whole thing and start from anew and with a totally fresh test there.
Right. Yeah. So I would say the worst, victims of this were the people who were mid-test and got booted.
Yeah.
Shortly behind them were the people who never got to take it as planned, but got to take another day. At least they didn't waste any work, basically.
No, but the problem that you started to see was immediately people were like, well, what are they going to do about retaking? Mm-hmm. And I could see that the numbers were getting relatively high. And you and I talked about this, and you saw me post it online, where I said, look, they don't have too many options. Fortunately, to some extent, it happened on the very first day. So they have Sunday and Tuesday and Thursday already planned out to take tests. So they could use those days. one of the things I said on Twitter was they could also add a test day, which they ultimately did. That was what we saw go down yesterday. So they did the kind of things that we actually expected them to do. But notice what that does. It means for a lot of people, they weren't coming back that afternoon to take the test. They were getting kicked into a later part of the week. And as we ultimately saw, they segmented the groups, which we're not going to talk about the segments that they made, but we'll talk about how people got different options. And what that meant is that for some people, they already had plans.
Right.
You know, I was talking to somebody and they're like, well, we've got a family reunion from Thursday through Sunday. And the 2 dates they gave us was Thursday and Sunday. We can't do it. I was like, you need to go talk to them because there is another day out there.
Yeah, I knew people that had made hotel arrangements to have like a safe, secure, quiet place to take it. That didn't do them any good on last Saturday, so they got to do that again. I knew some people testing Saturday that weren't able to take it until this coming Thursday, the 21st, which is an almost 2-week delay. That might seem like a gift, but if you're ready to take this test, another 2 weeks is torture.
Oh, how about the guy I talked to who had flown back home to take it?
I saw that too, I think,
Take it on Saturday, see his family, and I think he was flying back out on Sunday. He's like, I can't take it where I was at. This is, it's a different type of disaster. And that's the problem is that people aren't replaceable in this sense. It's not just like, well, everybody has a free day. Somebody's like, well, they want me to take it on Thursday. I have to work. I'm like, again, complain. You have to self-advocate in these situations. And one of the things that I often say is that you're dealing with a big corporation, essentially. But they often, because of that, have resources that they hold in reserve. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we saw almost immediately was when the wave of problems began hitting and people started calling the phone numbers, they were all told initially, your retake is on October 21st. Which is normally what happens. You normally do get kicked back to the Thursday a week and a half later for a retake. However, I'm sitting there and I'm like, absolutely no way they're going to do that. They can't have all these people take it on one day. They're going to give them options. I knew that, but the people on the phones at LSAC didn't know it. Yeah. And so the first piece of misinformation was, oh, everybody must do a retake on the 21st, which led to all this, I can't take the test on Thursday. And this is where the information, I felt like you and I were actually able to do some really good help out there because I was like, no, I think they're going to actually come forward with it. The problem is they can't just say, this is what we're doing because it takes time for them to set up the retest. If you started on Saturday, saw part of the test, they got to make sure that you don't see that test again. So they have to figure out where they can fit you in. And it becomes a logistical nightmare for them. And it essentially sucks on all sides is really what it comes down to.
That became our surprise Saturday morning roles, basically. We weren't in there trying to collect test information anymore. We were in there actually trying to provide customer service. In fact, I was kind of laughing to myself on Saturday thinking, like, I don't know if LSAC does Employee of the Month, but if they do, Dave, I hope you have your acceptance speech ready.
You should get one too. We should be co-employee of the month.
All right.
I think they realize that. And, it's one of those things where they're like, they're hesitant to say something that might later on turn out to be wrong. And so I completely sympathize. And, that's why we hedged ourselves. But that is a role that I hate the fact that we had to do it, but I was glad that we were able to do it. And so it's, by the time the outage actually started to end, I was very excited by that. I was like, thank God this is over because now people can test. And, that was a good moment, but it was still terrible for all the people who'd just been affected over the prior several hours.
Yeah, it was really a case of conflicting emotions for both of us at that point. I mean, it was still a tragedy from the morning. And God, we just weep for those people in a way. But we were also excited that it didn't go all day or that it didn't go all weekend. At least people were getting in there in the afternoon. So
yeah, somebody gave me a hard time on Twitter, like, why are you so excited about this? And I'm like, because it's ending, man. And then they posted another thing. I was like, where's the love for all the people who were affected? I was like, have you been watching what I've been doing? I'm like, I've been posting about this all morning. Of course, they couldn't see that I'd probably DM'd with 50 to 60 people at that point.
At least, yeah.
You couldn't see that I was talking to person after person being like, hey, let me help you out with this. And later on, they apologized. They said, look, I was upset. And I'm like, I hear you. It's all right.
It's clearly passionate.
I was like,
you can have simultaneous emotions. Like this is entirely possible to feel two things at once.
It's like direct your anger elsewhere. I'm actually the good actor here. That irked me, clearly.
Well, yeah. I'd still say in the long line of irked people on Saturday, you and I are near the back of it.
Yeah, totally. It bounced right off me, but I was like, I'll pen you an angry email later.
So they've let people do makeups, and that's extended through this past Sunday and continues into this coming Thursday. They also did one other thing with the cancellation deadline, these October test results, which is they extended it to Saturday, October 23rd at just shy of midnight Eastern time. So this coming Saturday night is how long you have to decide if you want to keep or cancel your score. Unless you have score preview, of course, which is different.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here is that I was immediately concerned because I was like, when they announced that they were going to add a Sunday test, I was like, that's outside the cancel window. Yeah. So these people from Saturday who did test, we can't put a podcast out when one of the main testing days is still yet to go. And then shortly thereafter, they came back with, we're going to extend the cancellation deadline as well. And I was like, all right, good. Now I don't feel quite so bad. We can push this podcast off and still everyone can have the same amount of information throughout the entire horizon of their decision-making process.
Yeah, so that was a nice concession. I was glad to see it. Let's talk a little more forward-looking here. This, I'd love to think, is a one-time event. It's certainly the most, I think, extensive we've ever seen something like this happen. There's always tech problems at every administration, but nothing this globally catastrophic.
Yeah, this was big.
What do you do, even on a smaller scale, what do you do if you face issues?
First thing is to do is put it in writing. Use the complaint form or, student response form that is inside your LSAC account. Go write it down. On a day like what happened on Saturday, and normally what they're doing is they're monitoring it. They see something come in, they act immediately. But when you've got hundreds of complaints coming in, you're not going to get an instantaneous response. But you do want to put it down in writing. And keep in mind that if you call, oftentimes their phone individuals are well-meaning, but they're a step behind in the information. That's why they were saying, oh, it's October 21st when you retake it. And it's like, it's not going to be that way for this. This is much, much bigger than that. So you got to self-advocate, though, too. One of the things that I saw here was that individuals were given choices that were untenable with their schedules. And they're like, what do I do? And I was like, ask for the final retake date, which is, in fact, the 21st, because it is still out there. And a lot of those individuals were able to get with them and finally say, look, you did this to me, and get to someone who was like, you're right, we'll go ahead and move you to that date. There's always a retake date for every one of these instances. This problem was so big, we knew there were going to be multiple retake dates, but you have to keep going back. And one of the things I saw online, which really bothered me, was that people would come in and be like, I talked to someone on the phone and they said this. And I'm like, that's not going to be accurate in the long run. And then I'll come in there and be like, hey, I think what you might see is something like this. And then they get mad at me. Well, I just talked to the person. They told me this. Are you saying that you know more than LSAC? I'm like, no, I don't know more. I just know maybe that things can change over time. That's what they think right now. It might change. So I hate when there's a fluid situation like that because things evolve so fast. But you have to self-advocate. You have to go in there, document the problem, explain how it was not your fault, and then look actively for options that will work for you.
Yeah, as I told many, many people over the weekend, the first thing they tell you isn't necessarily the final thing you'll get, but you have to be polite but persistent.
Great line. Yeah, your initial reaction isn't the final resolution.
Exactly right.
So I think that is something that you can really take to heart. That's sometimes why I've told people, call them back. See if you get somebody else. And then they'll be like, I got someone else who did this. And I'm like, that's the difference. It's tough. I would not want to be a customer service rep for them because when things happen and they really go south, they're dealing with a lot of irate individuals. And anybody who's ever worked retail before knows that dealing with the public can be a challenge. And in this case, the public comes in and they have been wronged. So they have every right to complain. And those people end up dealing with a lot of that.
Yes, their phone doesn't ring much for like celebratory news. It's either I need something or I had an issue. Not like, I just want to tell you guys you're doing a great job, LSAC. That's not a call they get.
No one never ever calls that. Maybe we can spur a wave of people to be like, hey, my test went well. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Tie up their phones some more.
Next time I'm in Newtown, someone will buy me a drink. Be like, I had a good day today.
Well, it's a thankless job, I'm sure. So what would qualify you to get a retake necessarily? I'd say it has to be something fairly catastrophic.
Yeah, they're not going to give it to you if you had a minor problem. And I saw some individuals who were kind of like saying, well, I had this little issue. Do you think they'll do it? And I was like, that's not going to qualify. Well, how do they know? I'm like, they'll know. They'll go back and figure it out. And that was part of what they did over the weekend is they stopped and they said, well, who was affected? Because at first they were like, oh, all these people have been majorly affected. And then they took time to go back and take a look at the results. And they said, well, some of these people were totally affected and it was terrible. But then they started to realize some of the individuals weren't affected, but were trying to like get a second shot. So they were like, hey, that's not going to work, unfortunately. If you have a proctor who kind of like pushes in for a second and takes over chat or takes over your mouse and it takes 15 or 30 seconds or 45 seconds, they're not going to give you a retake for that. That is proven at this point. It has to be something big. But if it is big, then you can push for that retake. And by the way, on this particular exam, one of my students just had messaged a little bit before that I retweeted that she had connection issues. She's doing the retake and they're going to offer not just the refund, but a free future test if she wants it, but you've got to ask for it. It's like you have to ask for things. You have to self-advocate in those situations. And you really, as I've said this before, if you've had a real serious situation, you can't give up. You have to be persistent about it. And again, you want to be a lawyer, get out there and start lawyering for yourself right now. And I know that sounds weird. It's not a harsh criticism or anything. It's like, no, that's by far the best thing to do when there are troubles during the test that have affected your outcome.
Yeah, self-represent. There you go. There was one other thing that I thought was somewhat unique to this test, which was the degree to which LSAC preempted certain discussions with, call it restrictions or prohibitions. They have always allowed us to talk about topics, about subject matter. I had a passage on this, or I had 2 sections of logical reasoning. Does anybody remember a question about goats or whatever? Why that was the first thing to come to mind. But this time they got out ahead of it and said, you're not even allowed to talk about topics in the way that you have previously. Not solutions, not strategies or answer choices, but even just simple topics they were cracking down on.
They were very proactive. They actually sent a message out to kind of the various companies that have forums and said, what they're really angling against is not so much the topics, it's the experimental section.
Identification of the experimentals, yeah.
Yeah, they did not want that referenced as much. And so they actually said to some companies, can you please put a notice up that says you can't talk about this until Thursday? Now that got extended because Thursday wasn't the last main test day. It was now yesterday was the last main test day. But in a normal world, what they were trying to do is to say, look, we realize people will talk a little bit. And they didn't get too chafed about, hey, I only had one RC and it was this. Where they seemed to really be much more interested was the idea of, hey, you're talking about experimental content and trying to figure it out. We don't want you to do that. And I haven't seen them do that at that level. Certainly, we got messages from them saying, hey, watch out for this. There's a post over here that we're concerned about. I saw them on Reddit, for example, under the LSAC security account saying, hey, that's a little bit too far. I know that they were in contact. So they really clamped down on the information. And I will say this made it more challenging for us. I know you and I, Jon, are used to kind of like a plethora of information that supplements what we already know about the test from other sources. Right. We didn't have that. And that makes it really challenging for us. It's been getting harder and harder over the last few months to pick out what actually is real, what is experimental. This is especially the case in logical reasoning where there are so many different questions in each section. So
easily the hardest test I've seen yet. The new format for sure. Yeah, I was going to say the upside of them doing this is that it does keep things more fair through the week. It doesn't give Tuesday people an advantage necessarily to know like, oh, if I see this passage topic, I know it's real or I know it doesn't count.
Yeah.
So that's the good. The bad is it just made our lives really, really difficult.
Yeah, and you ended up doing a lot of the work because I was kind of like preoccupied with a major thing that I've been working on. And that didn't really allow me to be as present as I normally am. So, hats off to you for compiling a lot of this. But as you and I both agreed, despite the fact that we both spent a ton of time looking at the tests and what people were saying and going through our own records of the past, we feel very strongly that there's probably inaccuracies in some of our rundown. We might have missed something. And it's just, when we don't get information, we can't confirm what we think is going on, and that leaves us high and dry. So if somebody's out there and they're like, oh, you didn't mention my section, I can't talk about what I don't know about. You know, if I haven't seen it and it's nowhere to be found, and it's, especially if it's never been administered before, it's going to be really tough for me to identify what it is. It's going to be really tough for you to put out a scale prediction on it. So,
yeah, it's clever of you to put the burden of this all onto me. So if we do see some inaccuracies,
did that
nudge,
on
nudge.
purpose. This one's all Jon's, by the way. I had nothing to do with it. So any mistakes are Jon's entirely.
I will say I did my best on what was ultimately some pretty flimsy information. By design, it was flimsy.
Yeah, they wanted it that way. But I mean, as you know, on Saturday, we both put in a large number of hours helping people try to get through it. It wasn't that I wasn't there. It's just that as the week went on, I had things that I had to deal with that were top priority and were time sensitive. So it was just that you had more of it. But you and I both share the responsibility for the identification and the scale prediction. So any problems therein, you blame Jon. Any correctness, I'll take the glory.
Sounds about right.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, no, it's perfect. It's exactly what I expected.
Excellent. That's the way I like it.
All right, one more thing, and then we can actually get into this October test itself. That one more thing is the last LSAT of the year, which is coming up here. It starts in November on Friday, November 12th. So a slightly different schedule for this one. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is the November test, and then there'll be some additional exams through the week for accommodations. The score release, I love what I'm about to say. The score release for that test is December 1st, which gives you 2 days to then decide to register for the January 2022 LSAT. January registration is December 3rd. So I love when there's at least a little bit of a gap. People can get their November results and then make a decision about the next one.
Exactly. Because sometimes people discover, oh, I really do need to take this test. And then in other cases, they're like, oh, now I don't have to register for it. Save myself some money, which I love.
That's exactly right. For instance, the October scores won't be out in time to register for November. So you had to make that call early. January, you can actually make better informed, I think.
Yeah. So with all that taken care of and that lengthy discussion of the problems and self-advocation and some of the uncertainties and really even how security kind of clamped things down, let's get into the discussion of the tests. And as always, I'm going to run through the reminders and the disclaimers that we have about the public test content. And then later on, we'll talk a little bit about the scaling. Everything that we're talking about is based on public knowledge. We may supplement it with information that we have on prior year tests, but even that was public knowledge when it was initially produced. And so we haven't gone out and, hijacked anything. It's all coming from what people have said, and we piece it together over time and get various reports. Second thing is this: your section order is meaningless. It does not matter. It changes constantly throughout the test. Just because you had the same section order as someone else does not mean that you had the same test content. What we are talking about today is test content and relative difficulty of that test content. So it's not that I don't care about section order. I'm always interested to see what people had. It's just that it doesn't mean anything in terms of what we're talking about, identification. Somebody says, well, I had games first. What were the games would be the question that I would say is the most relevant there, not that they were first. Secondly, we talked a little bit about disclosing information, and they're clamping down on it, especially when it comes down to the experimental. As we've already said, that makes it tough for us, and that could have an effect. So just keep that in mind. Next thing is, don't forget, when we talk about difficulty, it is all about the idea of relativity. I think every LSAT section is tough. So when I say it's easier or harder, it means in the tough zone. It's not like a simple test to kind of go through. It also means that when you take the LSAT, don't forget this: the actual experience of taking the LSAT is typically far worse than taking a practice test. It feels worse. And there's a negativity bias that will creep into your recollections from that. So sometimes people are like, I felt terrible about this. And then they hear us say that was on the easier side. And they think, A, I hate those guys, and B, they're wrong. We can all be right. is really what it all comes down to. You may have felt terrible about it, and it might not have been the hardest logic game section in the world. Those things are not diametrically opposed in terms of the reality of what occurred. So just keep that in mind as well. Another thing is that the test makers are actively now, very much actively trying to confuse you. They place the same topics in multiple sections. Great example was on the prior test when you had different reading comprehension passages that dealt with aspects of Nigeria. I look at that every time and I think, boy, they're doing something tricky here. Guess what? They did it again on this test. Was it criminals or was it people being indicted? Because that sounds really similar. So maybe I had the same game section as that person. No, you didn't. They were actually different. So keep that in mind when you go through it. Almost done with the list of disclaimers, Jon.
Getting near the end.
Trying to roll through it at high speed. So another thing is that our estimations of what's real and experimental are based on certain assumptions about how the test is made and about whether or not things are reused. So be aware of that. We could be wrong. I'll say that up front. I don't think we are. We don't, want to be in the business of being incorrect, but there's always the chance of exceptions. And then keep in mind, you might not hear about your section. One more time, you may not also recall all the questions in your section. So we may mention your section, but you don't realize you're just like, I don't remember a question about potatoes. But it was question 24, and maybe you didn't get to it or you were rushing, you don't remember it. And then the last thing, which is very important to both Jon and I, is please don't summarize this online. I'm seeing this very frequently. In fact, I saw it in an exchange I had with someone today online where their recollection of what we'd said was actually inaccurate. We hadn't said what they were attributing to us. And then someone else came in and gave us a different attribution that was also incorrect. So I would rather people hear it directly from us. If you want, you can tell them just go to the last half of the podcast, and that's where they'll talk about the test specifically. But the nuances that we talk about are almost always lost in any written summary. So we really, really appreciate it when you don't summarize it. And when I see people say, hey, they asked us not to, I'm always like, I like you. Thumbs up, plus one.
That's great. That might actually be the real disclaimer here is please use the timestamps. We just burned a half an hour talking about how things went wrong. If you're just here for the October discussion.
If things went right with you, you don't care.
I'm so sorry.
If you're taking it again, you need to know it.
Right.
All right, Jon. Let us talk about the International LSAT, which was this past Thursday. And I'm going to do the rundown on that because it's pretty straightforward. And then I will let you pull the majority of the regular domestic North American LSAT. All right, so first off, the test they used was the February 2013 LSAT. They've used this test many, many times, including back in July of 2020 as one of the flex sections, kind of setups there. This is a test that starts off, or it doesn't start off, but the logic games are relatively easy on this. There's office employees with badges, there's romance novels, there's parade floats, and then there's academic courses, by semester. This is not the most challenging logic game section out there. Again, that doesn't mean it's easy overall. It just means it's not as hard as other sections. Then you have reading comprehension, which covers things like formalism, jazz and bebop, paranormal activity, and then laundry detergent and chemical proteins. Pretty average section overall. Not as hard as some of the RC that we've been seeing on recent tests, which isn't a big surprise. It's from February of 2013. And then you have two different LR sections that they use, both of which are difficult. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple different question topics. They come from both of the sections. We haven't separated them out here. So you might say, I had that question, but I didn't have this other question. That's A-okay. We're just talking about questions that you would have seen that would have been real. So if you hear any of these, that means they were in your section. Spotted bears and the fish they eat, chlorinated water, library renovation, dry versus wet cat food, clay soil and acidic soil, El Nino, which is funny because I just learned yesterday that this is a La Nina year that will affect our weather on the West Coast significantly, which usually means less rain. So I'm depressed by that. X and Y cities and hospital populations, typhus, maternity leave, and of course Glee Club, something that I was not in high school, but my father was. So that's the rundown of the various questions, and they could have been in either section. Those were real, they were hard. Let's break the curve down. Okay. Start at -7 like we always do. Bad news for games. it is going to tighten it up from 7 to 6. Your RC is not going to have an effect. But the good news is, no matter which logical reasoning section you had, they were hard enough to loosen it again. And so you're scaling on this test -7.
There you go. Same as we called it back in July 2020 when we saw this test used. And I think it holds up. What to me is really interesting about this is literally every section type of this international test was either the hardest or the easiest of its sort for the whole scored set through the week. Isn't that interesting? This was the
RC.
No, I think RC was probably easier than the two other real RCs that we saw. I think the games were certainly easier than the two sets of games that we saw as scored. And the LR here was the hardest LR that we saw that was scored through the week.
I was thinking RC was in the middle at -0, but actually there were no other -0 sections.
As people will hear soon enough. Yes, sir. So I thought that was really interesting for this international group. But on the whole, and we've said this every time February 13 has been reused, which now I think is probably into the double digits, this is a fair test. Anyone who encounters this test down the road should feel at least a degree of gratitude, because there's nothing crazy, there's nothing outlandish here. Hard LR, but really nothing too overwhelming in this one.
And offset by a reasonable games and a reasonable RC, I'd probably take that. That's the kind of test that I don't mind in the least to deal with. Some of these hard RC tests, which is basically the rest of the real sections that we saw throughout the test week, they're brutal. They can hurt you in a way where it's like, I'm just out of my depth in terms of comprehending what I'm reading. So how do I answer the questions there? At least if a tough LR comes up, it's, all right, I missed one question, on to the next one. RC doesn't give you that luxury.
Yeah, very fair. I'll say this too for anyone out there who feels gypped with a -7. It's like, that tight, that's ridiculous. How dare you? One of the tests that they just released, PT91 Plus, is -7. So this is far from unprecedented. In fact, there's a very recent precedent.
All right, so let's move on from the international test takers. They're like, that's it? That's all we get? Yes, that's all you get. You got it first, though, so happy days. And you got your scale right away.
Yeah.
So hopefully that helps out. Again, I think a fair experience and a test that I wouldn't personally complain about if somebody threw it my way. Jon?
Nor would I. Yeah, let's move things domestic. So we'll start off Saturday morning talking about the test. We've already covered the rest of Saturday morning. Here's what we were seeing. So we started off with some real reading comp from Saturday morning, and you and I very quickly identified this as a repeat of the March 2019 LSAT. And again, for anyone who wonders how they're repeating these tests, February 13, March 19, it's because those tests were non-disclosed originally. They don't exist in the wild. You could not have previewed this content. The real reading comp from that test had these 4 passages. There was a passage about tipping servers. There was a passage about hominid evolution, I think having to do with upright posture, and savanna or grassland theory, so an out-of-Africa type passage. There was a passage in there about Roberto Arlt, an Argentinian novel literature, and irony is what that passage was about. And then finally, the comparative passage was about a parliamentary bill in 20th century Britain about restricting women and possibly children's work hours for the week or the day, and 2 sides on that particular issue. So those were the first set of reading comp passages that we saw.
Okay. So the interesting thing here is that we see March 2019 as the start. And as you will recount shortly, they used the rest of that test that was out there. And I'm gonna float in a very interesting theory that kind of relates to the last crystal ball that we did.
Oh boy. Okay.
One of the things that we'd put up there was we said, which test do we think they'll use? And we had proposed January 2019 as the first test. And then I had said, but any of the 5 here is possible. And March 2019 was the second on that list. I actually think that their original intention was to use January 2019. And they switched it. There were some things that we saw, especially with the security and so forth, where I actually think that we changed the course of what they were going to do, which is neither better nor worse, because January 2019 is not all that dissimilar in terms of its difficulty and its difficult RC and so forth. But the way they did this and the way I saw the security come up made me think that I wonder if their plan had originally been to use January 2019. They got wind of what we'd predicted, and I know that for a fact, and they said, how irritating, let's switch it.
Yeah, they didn't just get wind. They were in the room when we said it.
So, we'll see. This next crystal ball, I'm not sure how specific we'll get about the test they're going to choose, because I have weird feelings about the idea of affecting the possible choices of exams that are going forward. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I got to think about it. But that is actually my theory on this. And until somebody proves me wrong, I will be sticking to it.
That's pretty plausible. I have weird feelings about it too, but they're more like megalomaniac than yours. Yours are more cautious and mine are more like we're gods. But I'm fairly certain that it at least influenced their decision. Whether it changed their minds is hard to say.
Speaking of that, did you know that I once wanted to run some ads a while back called Gods of the LSAT, and then we'd put big shots of our face up. But then I looked at it and I said, Jon, you're so much better looking than me. I don't think I can be on that
I don't know
poster.
about that. I was just about to say make mine lowercase g, and I'll go with it.
Anyway, let's move on. So that was the RC that opened it up, and not an easy section at all. What other sections did we see?
Well, now that you've mentioned March 19, we can run right into the games from that test, because that was the other thing that started happening. First thing Saturday, for those people who could take it. Here are the 4 games that were real from March 2019. There was a game about a restaurant menu, or menu specials over a week, items like spaghetti. There was a game about a debate between 2 teams, a tricky game about crime suspects visiting different cities, and it was 2 cities over several months. And then finally, another game that gave people some trouble, 2 authors publishing books on planting crops. You're assigning book chapters to the 2 people. So those were the 4 games. If you recognize even one of those, and you're certain that section that it was in for you was real.
Yeah, and I will point out, indictments is not the same as the crime suspects visiting cities. So don't kind of like say, let's kind of equivocate between those 2. They're different, as we will see.
Yep.
And that was a tough game for sure. You certainly heard some complaints about that particular section. You want to just run through the rest of the LR from that test and then kind of circle back to some experimental stuff?
Yeah, why not? We could actually spot those games pretty early on. I mean, we knew March 19, but we'd even seen them all the way back in June 2017 as some experimental games, at least 1 or 2 of them.
Yeah, and I'll point out that this was a really disrupted period for us, because you had some people come out very early, a few people were done, and then all of a sudden there was this big logjam of no
Blackout,
information,
right,
because of the disruption that had occurred.
Yeah, let me get into the LR. And again, all of this that I'm saying so far is real. So if you recognize any of it, that section counted for you. Both the LR sections from that test had 25 questions. So in no particular compartmentalization to a section, here were some of the topics from March 19 from Saturday that were real. There was a question about blameworthiness and being morally wrong. A question about tutoring students and using spelling ability, I think, to predict academic ability. There was a question about psychics versus, I think it was psychology students. They were studying to test for psychic abilities. A chemical plant being built by a lake, talked about pollution. One I'd like to read about beans and amino acids. Apparently it was beans in the Middle Ages. It was a tricky question for people. Disease incidents in mountain and lowland possums, opossums. One that caused a lot of confusion in terms of real or experimental was a question about iron versus rock meteorites. That question was real, and it was a March 19 question. I believe these are the other section, but again, just know these are real. One of the hardest questions from this whole test was about rainfall and temperature changes over recent decades, and it had to do with summer humidity levels. It was a tricky question. There was one about apparent generosity versus true generosity, about telomeres and aging, gray hair, I think. There was a question about GHB and heart disease. That may have been one about olive oil and cardiovascular health. I heard both of those, but I feel like they might be the same. Question about TMAO and supplements, meat eaters versus vegetarians. And then finally, another question I'd like to see about War of the Worlds and radio, that old Orson Welles broadcast, I assume.
Classic broadcast, causing panic.
We're showing our age knowing that, I think, but there we go. I didn't hear it live, at least.
Neither did I, for whatever that's worth. It was like 1937 or something.
It was maybe in the 20s. But those questions were all real, and people started seeing them as early as Saturday morning. If you saw them later in the week, still real.
Yeah, so that test was used, I'd say, a fair amount.
Mm-hmm.
Let's run through some sections that we feel were paired with parts of that test at various times that were kind of experimental. And this is where things got really jumbled, because again, that test outage created like this void of information, and then all of a sudden there was a big flood of information.
Right.
We think there was an experimental section out there that was about paintings and presentations and a professor retiring. But to be honest, the lack of information that was online really hurt us here. So if you had that section with another, we think that was your experimental on that test.
Yeah, I got the feeling for that particular section that it was one that would have appeared a fair amount Saturday morning, but then there really was no Saturday morning. And so it just didn't quite make its presence felt in the way that it would have.
Yeah, I think that's insightful. There's another experimental game section that was 23 questions. It was about fruits, kiwis, limes, and then hike leaders and hiking tours. And then the fourth game on there, if you had this, you will remember it was a tough, tough game, maybe the toughest of the week. It was about research stations and 3 stations where they're switching positions with like biologists. That was experimental, but brutally tough to kind of deal with.
Yeah, I watched people discover that that was experimental in real time after the fact, and you could just feel the celebration in the air when that one wasn't going to count. I think that was the hardest game of the week.
I wonder if we'll see that game come back in a slightly changed form from what it was, because it was a rough scenario to kind of like, go through that section and then have that at the end. So sometimes that's what happens with these experimentals. So I think people think, oh, an experimental section is like, there it is, and they tested it, and now they send it off to the real world. That's not the case. I actually had the experience of seeing a game that I had previously done as an experimental come out as a real game later on, and they had changed it, and they'd made it easier, which irritated me because I was like, I had to do the harder version, and then I realized what they'd done is loosened it up and made it a little bit less problematic. But that's the kind of tweaks that they make. They see a problem, they might say, this LR question is good, but you know what? This phrase is causing an issue. Let's change it.
Yeah, this answer choice isn't giving us the feedback or the stats that we want. I've seen them do it with comparative reading, where they'll do 2 passages experimental and keep one and change the other.
Yeah. It validates some questions and they say you're free to go, but for the others, they get sent to a new queue that says either you're going to be ditched or you're going to be changed. So keep that in mind. It is a evolving process with questions. It's not just like, here we tried it and we're done with it. It's a lot of time and effort to make these questions. They don't just give up on them because of a little problem that they think is fixable.
Right. So there was also some experimental logical reasoning going on Saturday. And again, if you saw these sections later in the week, still unscored, still experimental. Here are some of those questions. There were one section I know had a question about roasted chicken. Same section it had an experimental question about tyranny. So if those ring any bells, that section, you can discount it. One of the sections that was experimental that I have a fair amount of information on, there was a question about moas, a now sadly extinct old New Zealand flightless bird. There was a question, hard question here about Earth and its hot core and magnetic fields, tectonic activity. I heard some people say that it had to do with the moon's gravitational pull, so lunar gravity and earthquakes. There was a question that a lot of people were talking about tickets on overseas timeshares. Same section had a question on ducks getting stuck in fishing nets. There was a question about Cockney dialects, I think compared to Californian dialects, whatever those are.
Do people often do that?
Yeah, I don't know. Then students and movie preferences was another question in that section. Again, all of those experimental, and I think that section had 26 questions.
And that was a hard section too, harder than the real LR for almost everybody who had that section.
So again, you could see the celebrations when they discovered the MOAs section didn't count. People were like, oh, thank goodness.
So are you telling me that instead of calling New Zealanders Kiwis, we could have actually ended up calling them the MOAs?
The MOAs? Yeah. Why not?
I like Kiwi better.
I think I do too. Let's see, what else was experimental? There were some questions, I think, in a different section about that a country should classify species as endangered. Speaking of MOAs. A question about vitamin E in broccoli. And then I believe a different section, but again, don't quote me on that, had a question, again, all experimental, on Yunkel, which was the name of the company, making fruit juice with added colors and sugars. Question about lucid dreaming and your moral culpability, moral behavior and severe harm. It's pretty generic. And then the qualities of persuasive speakers. So if any of those ring a bell and you're certain that it matches, you can, again, discount that entire section where it appeared.
Wouldn't mind seeing that lucid dreaming question.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
Curious about lucid dreaming, period, but the question itself would be interesting.
Well, what's the culpability factor there?
Yeah,
is that where somebody wakes up and they're like, you cheated on me in a dream, so I'm mad at you all day? Or is it that you're lucid dreaming and you actually caused some type of accident or problem.
Yeah, like I dreamed I robbed a bank. Where'd all this money come from? That kind of thing.
Sounds like The Mask.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's what was going on Saturday. So we were off to a rough start in terms of the test takers, but at least we had our finger to the pulse of what was going on for the most part. Tricky to pin down by section, but at least we could categorize by real or not. Saturday afternoon, if we're ready for it. You have more?
No.
Okay. I heard you inhale.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in, but you go.
Okay, I'm on a roll. Saturday afternoon, we got more real reading comp, 27 questions, and this, I think, was probably the harder of the two real reading comps. This was the one with passages about the Mali Empire, about another one about hominids. This was about paleo hominids and biological adaptation, evolution. A lot of confusion there, obviously by design. Passage there about Alice Munro. This, as I heard her called, some old Canadian lady, which she very much is, or was. But her short story collection, she used to write for Dear Life. And that was the comparative passage in this section. And then finally, a really tough passage on paternalism, paternalistic laws of the state, privacy, and they reference John Stuart Mill in this passage as well. So if anybody heard about John Stuart Mill through the week, that was this passage, and it was real, that whole section.
Yeah, anytime you're talking about John Stuart Mill in reading comprehension, it's probably not going to be easy. But notice how you get some of these elements that are repeating. Hominids, again, mentioned elsewhere. And paternalism or paternalistic, also mentioned on other sections. So you have to be super careful when you're talking about this afterwards, not to, or even really just reading about it. If you're reading something, you're like, I had that, make sure you had all of it. Somebody using just one code word for a passage can be very misleading, in part because if you watch LSAT students talk about a reading comp passage, it almost evolves over time. Mm-hmm. They'll use one description, then another, and then finally everybody kind of settles on what the name of it is. And some of them are easy. Mali. When you have that, the Mali Empire, it's like, all right, everybody came out and that was what it was. But then the John Stuart Mill one was called all sorts of different things over the course of the week. At first I was like, wait a second, I know this John Stuart Mill passage. I've heard it before. Where is it? And then we were able to connect it back to the paternalism one. And that's the kind of work that we end up doing, and that takes time. It just wasn't clear to us at first. If you've taken it, you're like, oh yeah, of course those two are the same. I'm like, yeah, but I didn't take that test, so I don't know for sure. I'm trying to figure that out. That's the detective work that we engage in a very small piece. Yeah. And then connect it back to what we already know about some of this, and then that can be its own kind of, needle in a haystack kind of hunt.
What really impressed me with you in that John Stuart Mill reference is not only did you connect it to the paternalism passage this time, but you were like, I swear I've seen this before. And you were able to track down the origin, presumably, of it, which was a September 2017 accommodated test that had a passage on John Stuart Mill. That's unbelievable.
And it's funny because I think people are like, oh, it's just right there. No. There are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of tests with thousands of questions. And if somebody called a passage paternalism and we didn't note that John Stuart Mill was in it, it's easy to miss that connection. Mm-hmm. So it really is kind of like a detective process where we're kind of like, what was this about? And it's, I think, taught us over time to be very careful in terms of jumping to a conclusion. Like we see something like last time with Nigeria, and we're not like, oh, well, that's it. There's one passage on Nigeria. We're like, wait a second. Hominids here is another great example. Mm-hmm. You just have to be careful.
Yeah, you alluded to the idea of paternalism or paternalistic twice. It happened in the real passage here in that section with Mali and the rest, but it happened in an experimental passage too. So there was a lot of opportunity for confusion. I think we avoided it, but it was there.
Yeah, that was a different section entirely.
Entirely different, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, why don't we just hit that one while we're at it? Because there was an experimental reading comprehension that was reportedly not the toughest section out there. And it did use paternalistic in a passage, I think, about metaphors in the brain.
Exactly.
But it was a passage that, to me, notably, had a topic that was the ancient hanging gardens of Babylon, which I believe is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Of the ancient world, yes.
Yeah. And so I'd like to read that passage, but of course they're not offering. And there's one on Frederick Douglass that I'm sure would be interesting. And then another one that was, I think, on privacy, bankruptcy, something along those lines. But that was an experimental section. But notice how, again, paternalistic comes up. Easy to get that confused and think based on that one code word that you had the same thing.
Yeah, but again, to double down, triple down, if you had a passage on Frederick Douglass that you can recall, even if you can't remember the other three, that section was experimental.
Same thing with Babylon and the ancient hanging gardens.
Exactly. So that was the RC we were seeing through Saturday afternoon, and the experimental you just mentioned into Sunday morning. There was another, what seemed to be real logical reasoning set that was out there that we saw Saturday afternoon. And I only have 2 questions from it, so it's possible this matches some stuff that I've read before, but the 2 questions I know. One was whether a city should build a monorail. Sounds like one of my favorite old Simpsons episodes.
Simpsons.
There
monorail,
you go.
Monorail.
And another question in there, which just sounds like most of my teen years, when thievery is morally justified.
Always.
Yeah. So those are the only 2 topics I have, but those appear to have been from a real section and a fairly, from what we heard reports of, fairly standard average section. So there you go. But that takes us into Sunday and a little bit into Sunday morning with the experimental you just did with reading comp. We did now on Sunday morning get another set of real logic games. 23 questions. Here were the games. The first, I believe, was about a photographer photographing politicians. It was a game about 7 people arriving in a city, maybe a country, over about 5 days. Here was the confusion. There was a game in there, a hard game, about suspects being indicted in a fraud case. So recall, in the other real section of games, there was a game, the third game, about criminals, in that case visiting cities. Here you have criminals, suspects being indicted in a fraud case. That's so similar that a lot of people were tripped up. And the fourth game in this section was, again, a tough one. 6 musicians, it was violinists and pianists, who were auditioning for duets and different types of genres of music, folk, jazz, things. And that was probably the hardest game on that test.
That was a tough section overall.
Tough section, yeah.
Harder than probably the other real logic game section that was in here.
I agree.
So, getting close to the end, though, at least.
We are, yeah. We're nearing the end here. There's one more set of real logical reasoning that we could see. 25 questions in this section. Here were some of the topics. Flowers, sending chemicals apparently to prevent other flowers from growing. There was a question there about real estate and interest rates. A question about old Socrates. And then finally a question about life being fulfilling. Those were real questions. So again, if you can recall Socrates or the flowers with chemicals, that was real, whatever else there was. One left, and now we get to really take this thing full circle. Now we come to our song choice. There was an experimental reading comp section. You want to take it?
No, you got it, man.
All right, you did pick the song.
You've done the yeoman's work here. Let's finish it off.
There was an experimental set of reading comp, 27 questions again, and here were the 4 passages. And again, the namesake of the songs for today. There was a passage about outcast, rap, and innovation is what that passage was about. There's a passage in there about blackmail, legal passage about why blackmail is illegal. It's a passage about one-sided contracts. I think this may have had to do with like the service terms at a company, like reading the terms and conditions.
I always read mine, don't you?
Oh, yeah. Every time I upgrade iTunes, I block an afternoon off to read.
There's a great South Park about, you don't read your terms of service? Everybody in town reads it except like Cartman or something like that.
I remember that one. Was that the human centipede one? The human cent iPad? I'm pretty sure that's the one it was. I don't want to ever
think about that again. Yes, you're right. That's what it is.
That's the one. Steve Jobs in there, like, you should have read it.
I didn't need to rethink about that part of it. Couldn't I just remember the good part of that episode, not the evil, hellish part?
And then finally, the last passage in this section. So outcast, blackmail, one-sided contracts. And then there was a passage, and the only thing I know about it is it was about dichotomy. So if that rings a bell, good for you. It didn't count.
It's too bad, though, because I think a passage about outcast sounds like something that would be pretty fun.
And apparently people agree with you, because all reports were that that was an easier reading comp section.
Yeah, they wanted it to be real.
Yeah. So it's interesting as I was thinking about these experimentals, because most of the scored stuff was fairly middle of the road, as we're about to get into with our scoring prediction matrix. But what you had with the experimentals was some real divergence. You had some very easy reading comp, the outcast section, again, relatively easy. You had some very hard games, that biologist switching stations game. Thank goodness for most people that was experimental.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was pretty smooth sailing for the real stuff, but man, there was some distractions on either side of the aisle.
And again, testing difficulties, not all that surprising to see this. This is one of the things that I always try to counsel people afterwards. They're like, well, it was just too hard to be real. I'm like, careful. Every once in a while, there are sections that are real that are brutally difficult. And sometimes you see the flip side. Oh, it was too easy. I'm like, also careful. They do have easy sections. It's never about trying to find a baseline of average. It's about piecing together an entire test that averages out. If I have a really hard logic game section and I am looking at that, in their minds, they can offset that with easier reading comp and easier logical reasoning. So the fact that something's hard or easy doesn't tell us automatically whether or not it is real. It is the collective whole that actually determines this. So
Yeah, well said.
With that in mind, it doesn't really change anything, but sometimes when people have flash reactions, they say things where they're like, well, it has to be this. I'm like, nothing really ever has to be the case. This is their world. We live in it. They make their choices. That gets us to the scoring matrix. And the interesting thing here, Jon, is that the matrix, I think we've had challenges with it in terms of just like tracking everything and, trying to keep it straight. And I think you and I are still both under the debate of whether or not it's fully accurate because of the lack of information. But there were really only 2 logic game sections and 2 reading comp sections that were widely used that were real.
Yeah.
And so that gives us a really easy base to work from. And then amazingly, a lot of the scored LR was seemingly very similar in difficulty. So you've handled the big stuff. Hit the matrix, man.
Okay. You always do this part, so lucky me.
You want me to do it, or you?
No, I'm happy to do it. And this will actually be quick because, as you say, it's fairly consolidated, fairly condensed. So again, same as with the international, we always start at -7. That's our baseline. Let's see how and if it moves. So let's talk about... Well, go
First, though, I'm going to give the disclaimer that you always give.
Oh.
I'm going to reverse roles here. You always stop me right at this point and you say,
that's true.
Don't forget that when we are on the border and we're not sure, we always go more conservative. It's better to think a test is one thing and have it be looser than to have it be the reverse. So any kind of estimation that we make is going to be on this conservative side.
Yeah, we tend to round down. So that in mind, we'll start at -7, and thank you for that, Dave. That needed saying, and I probably wouldn't have. Let's start with games. So again, just 2 scored sections of games. On Saturday, we saw March 19. This was the restaurant menu items, debate teams, crime suspects visiting towns, authors writing the book about crops. Frankly, this was an average or a medium difficulty section. I don't think this moves the curve, so I think this is a 0. If you had those games, you're still at -7. There was another set of games, though, that was real. This was the photographers and politicians, people arriving in a city, the fraud suspects indicted, and then the hardest game, the musician duets. This was a harder section, certainly harder than the March 19 stuff. This should loosen the curve by 1, in my estimation. So if you had these games, you are now at a -8.
Very good.
Let's move on to reading comp. Again, 2 scored sections that we can confirm of reading comp. One from March 19. This was tipping servers, Savannah hominids, Argentinian fiction with Arlt, and then the British women's work hours. This was, I'd say, the easier of the 2 reading comps, but still hard. Hard enough, in my opinion, to actually loosen the scale by 1. So, if you had the authors on crops and the crime suspects visiting town and the tipping servers, Argentinian fiction reading comp, this moves you to a -8. This loosens it by 1. If you had the fraud suspects and the musician duets, and then this reading comp, this moves you from a -8 to a -9. So happy day there.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say both reading comprehension sections, which you're about, in fact, you hit the second one.
I'll do the second one.
A similar effect.
Yeah.
I just jumped in.
No,
anyway.
It's fine. I did kind of allude to it. I said this was the easier of the 2, and it still loosens it by 1.
Yeah.
So I imagine people could see what was coming.
With games, one of them has no effect, and the other loosens what's happening, and that's the musicians' duets game.
That's right.
A lot of people say they hate violin and pianist duets from now on out. And then the reading comprehension doesn't matter. It's going to loosen it by 1. But I'll let you run down the second one.
Yeah, just to clarify, the other scored section of reading comp that we saw on Sunday, this was the Mali Empire, the Paleo hominids, Alice Munro, and then paternalism. Again, that tough passage with John Stuart Mill. I think this is the harder of the 2, but I still think it's a safe probably safer bet to say it's going to loosen it by 1. So it's possible at this point you're to -8 if you had the crime suspects visiting town authors on crops games. It's possible you're to -9 if you had the musician duets games. Those are the 2 outcomes so far. And just to spoil it, it's not going to change as we talk about logical reasoning. Every scored logical reasoning section that we could confirm should have no effect, loose or tight on the scale. They're all a 0. And that's, again, I think that's entirely intentional. It's by design. It's as it should be. You don't want too much variation on luck of the draw, or as you call it, the LSAC casino. This keeps things fairly standardized, and that to me is the way that the test week should play out, frankly. So no matter your scored logical reasoning, if it matched some of the stuff we said, it won't change your score, it won't change your scale, rather. You're at a -8 or a -9 no matter what at that point.
Which I think is pretty reasonable overall. And you can see with these tests, this continues this trend of tough RC. It's just been that way for a while now. Games is a little bit variable in this particular instance, 0 or 1. Logical reasoning isn't always going to be this way, where it's like, hey, most of the sections we don't think have an effect. Usually you end up with a section or 2 that has a loosening effect, sometimes one that tightens it. But in this case, we had a real hard time with LR. I'll just say that up front. Very difficult for us to know in a lot of cases what we were actually looking at. And that's really what our best estimate is. Now, if you're an experienced LSAT taker and you had some section of LR and you're like, look, I feel like that was harder, then take that into account. Trust yourself. That is always a very important thing here. And especially the more you know about the LSAT, the more of them that you've taken, the longer that you studied for it, the higher your score. Go with your own gut feeling on that. This is a direct result of the fact that they clamped down a little bit more. It's something that we'll keep an eye on going forward, because the more it gets clamped down, the less information that we receive, the harder it actually becomes for us. And as long as we feel like we can make predictions that are pretty close to accurate, we're going to keep on doing it. But the day when we feel like we just don't have enough information to do it, we'll stop. So I don't know whether that day's coming soon. I hope not. But the current state of information on this test is getting less and less and less. And that is clearly by the design of LSAC. I understand why they're doing it. I'm not complaining about it. I'm just making an observation.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I will tell you what gave me a little more confidence in the 0 for LR is we actually saw some sections of LR that were almost objectively more difficult, 2 of which come from the international test, the February 2013 exam. That LR was harder than any of the LR I heard about being tested for the domestic exams. One of the experimental LRs as well, the one with MOAs and the Earth's hot core and magnetic fields, that was a harder section of LR than what I was seeing being tested. So knowing that there were harder things in play at least gives some context for the middle-of-the-road nature of what we're predicting here.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. And then despite all the problems on this test, as we said before, their intention is to not have score release affected. So we'll find out those results on Wednesday, October 27th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 6 a.m. Pacific. Scores all go out pretty fast now, so usually they're out within 5 or 10 minutes in a big old wave, whereas before, sometimes you'd see them come out over hours. That was terrible. But that is the summary of the LSAT that we just saw. A very unique LSAT that had an incident in it that has really not been replicated, certainly not at this level, and I hope is never, ever replicated again.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's all you can say. Cross your fingers, hope for the best, but prepare for these sorts of things in the future, and at least now you know what to do if they happen to arise.
Yeah, and if you do run into problems, self-advocate as much as you can.
Be a pest.
So that is the wrap up there. I'll remind everybody one more time that we are doing a crystal ball this Wednesday, October 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern. And as always, we will go into some details about what to study, how to spend your time moving forward, what we think is actually going to be on this test. And as we will show, our historical predictions have been, I would say, remarkably accurate.
Yeah, and not to...
You're not disagreeing.
I'm just going to leave it. I'll just let people attend and form their own judgments. I'll leave it
As
at
you can imagine, we've been putting that webinar together, and one of the things we always do is we always try to change it up. We don't like to do the same thing twice because, to be honest, it bores us. So we're always adding wrinkles to it and different things that we're actually showing. And certainly in this case, Jon's had some great suggestions in terms of like, hey, let's look at this. And
It's been fun.
The revealing data has been edifying for us, I'd say, is the best way for me to actually put it.
And gratifying, frankly.
Gratifying, yeah. So if you have a chance, please join us, and that will be for the November LSAT, and we'll kind of like loop the January LSAT into that as well. So that also takes into account the new sections that they have released recently. So it is not going to be identical in terms of statistics to what we have actually seen before. Jon, any final comments?
No, man. I'm going to go pour another White Russian, crank some Stankonia. That's an Outcast album for you less hip souls.
Yeah, dude. Come on, man.
I knew you would know.
I've lived in the South. I'm definitely familiar with that. All right. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions for us, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We'll certainly be doing a mailbag episode at some point in the future, and so we hope to get to your question if you do send us one. On behalf of Jon and myself, stay safe out there. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.